weeks. Now, the LCK uses a Gauntlet playoff format and has during the entire period since it changed from OGN Champions into LCK League Champions Korea. Now, the essential format of LCK is you have a double round robin, best of 3 regular split. The top 5 teams make the playoffs, although technically that last match is some sort of like a qualifier match. So the top 4 are the ones who are playing the best of 5s. And the seeding for those matchups is based on your regular season finish. But unlike in LCS or past seasons of LPL at times, rather than it being like, okay, number 1 plays number 4 in the semis maybe. Instead, there's only one matchup per round of the playoffs. That's why it's a gauntlet. You run through the gauntlet. If you're team 5, you've got to beat team 4, team 3, team 2, and then team 1 to win the title. So the seeding means 4th and 5th place play in round 1. 3rd place waits in round 2 for the winner of that match. 2nd place waits in round 3 for the winner of the previous match. And the 1st place team in the regular split already is in the final. They don't have to play any other match than the final. This is actually the same format, which this is one of the reasons why we often use the term gauntlet, has been used many times as the regional qualifier. It actually was first used in the Korean region for season 2. That's the one where famously Najin Sword made it all the way through and beat Blaze, who was actually one of the best teams in the world, to qualify, and Blaze therefore didn't qualify as the 2nd seed from Korea. It's been used every year in Korea. It's actually been used in the West since I think it was season 5 onwards. It's also the exact same format that Koreans have always loved from their team leagues back in StarCraft Brood War. That's what the StarCraft Pro League used to use. Once you got to the playoffs, you went through a gauntlet system. Now, the logic behind this is to reward regular split placing. Because if you are the top seed, you place 1st place in the regular split, you can't go out in the 1st round. You can't have some humiliating upset like can happen in the NBA or the NHL. You can't have a scenario where, I mean, in the LCS, you could still go out top 4. You could still come in 4th place in theory, even if you come 1st in the split. Obviously, famously, the SK Gaming team that had Forgiven in it from Season 5 Spring, in fact, did do that. They finished 4th despite having won the regular split and finishing in 1st place. If this method that they used in LCK had been used, they could have at worst finished 2nd place. So the idea is, okay, the top seed gets rewarded heavily. He goes straight to the final no matter what. The other logic is it encourages teams to battle as hard as they can throughout the split at all times. Because the logic is you can't be a really good team and who knows that they're going to be really good in the playoffs, has a lot of experience, maybe past champions, and go, you know what, we'll fuck around a bit, we'll chill out a little bit, and we'll still make the playoffs anyway. And once we make the playoffs, since we are the best or one of the best teams, we can get our asses in gear, we can prep for the opponent, and we can win any series anyway. Like, seeding doesn't matter as much for us. Seeding here moves you on through rounds of the playoffs. So unlike in the past, the classic Fnatic team with Xpeke and Soaz, which used to just dick around and then make the playoffs anyway, obviously in the Origin days they did this especially. G2 you think of in 2017, you think of TSM in some of the past years, obviously Season 6 Spring where they had that nightmare split, but they still made it to the final and almost won the tournament rather. Obviously this year they were in really bad form, still made the playoffs, admittedly didn't go that far. But the point is you can't do that anymore in this system. You are encouraged, incentivized to practice even harder. The key difference though is that you only have that one path to the final. So on another level, you can't avoid a tough opponent. Like in a normal single limb bracket, you could have a matchup where a team that would have beaten you loses to the perfect counter matchup to them, who might be a lower seed, and you get an easier route through the bracket, or you get the easy side of the bracket and can make the final and play one of the best teams in the world, but you could still finish at worst 2nd, whereas maybe you're actually only, say, the 4th best team in the world. That kind of scenario can't happen here because you have to go through all these top seeds, and it's based on seeding to get to that final. The problems with this system are, and there's a number that I think, because, okay, some of those aspects, yeah, I can see the positives in those, can see why you might like them, why they actually do enforce to some degree the integrity, the competitive integrity of the regular split and make it not meaningless. It's not just for seeding like LCS has nearly always been. Problem is, first of all, rewarding placing like that is not necessarily such a good trade-off. Because what you're saying is, I'm going to make a playoff bracket, but I'm going to eliminate the majority of what would have been the matches in this playoff bracket by making it just that you get seeded round by round instead of just seeded into the first round of the playoffs or the semi-finals in the first round. And I'm going to say that's going to encourage you to have a really great place in the regular split. Now, I already did a video on this topic. I think there should already be an actual tangible monetary and acknowledgement reward for your placing in the split anyway. Like, I actually think if you place first place in the regular split, you should get a trophy for the regular split and you should get prize money for being first place in the regular split. That's another great way to incentivize people to constantly battle for every spot, even if they're already in the playoffs, and to try and outright win the split, as opposed to just not really care otherwise or think, oh, we'll make it through a bracket anyway. So that would take care of that. You wouldn't need to eliminate all these matches. Then you've got to ask yourself, when you have this one route to the final, you are going to not only have less matches, but you're going to get a lot less variety in terms of what matchups are possible. Because if there's a team, as there has been many times in history in different team sports and including in League of Legends, a scenario where, say, the fourth best team in the region, so I'm thinking in the past of a team like a Freak of Freaks, for example, actually has some sort of weird matchup where they could beat the best team in the region. So let's think SK Telecom, the team they classically used to beat a year or two ago. In this scenario, if they play a normal bracket, they might get to play in the semi-final. They might even play in the first, well, they couldn't really play in the first round in this scenario, but they might play in a semi or whatever it might be. But if Afrika's really the fourth seeded team and SK Telecom's number 1 or number 2, then Afrika has to get past, first of all, number 5, then they have to beat number 3, and then they might even have to beat number 2 to ever play against SK Telecom. So you get less variety in terms of playoff matches because there's less matches and there's only the one route and it's all predetermined and set by the regular split. That actually makes, for me, the playoffs not as good, not as interesting. You don't get those brackets where the way the bracket goes and the specific matchups can determine what happens. One of the reasons I've always been a massive fan of the NHL playoffs is because it's always been like that. That's a sport where it's massively predicated on matchup, not where you're placing necessarily. You can have tons of matchups between seed 2, seed 7, seed 3, seed 6. That could be an amazing game, and sometimes the underdog will upset. This wouldn't happen in this sort of scenario. Seed 6 is very unlikely to ever get to play seed 3 in a scenario where, let's say, 6 teams made the playoffs. You also get less games of the best teams. For me, this is the worst aspect of this Gauntlet system, is that when you have one of the best teams of all time, so let's say they dominate in the regular split, they're one of the best teams, you want to see them in the playoffs, right? You want to see, well, just how dominant are they in a playoff setting with all the pressure, all the lights, everyone else going 100% of them at all points in time, trying to compete for history. You don't get to see that because if they're really dominant in the regular season, they will either be in the finals, so they'll play one playoff series, or at worst, they'll be in the third round, which means they might play 2 playoff series, and then they're done. That's it. So you don't get these scenarios where, think of all the great teams of the past, Azubu Frost with Mad Life and Cloud Templar and Rapid Star and Shy, obviously, all those amazing playoff runs to the finals, all those great matchups they had. Sometimes they would play, I think there was one where they played like, I think was it them who played Incredible Miracle that year and like OGN Winter and had a really close series against them. Obviously, they always played their sister team, Blaze, often and beat them. You wouldn't get these matchups. If they were the number 1 seed, they'd just wait in the final. And let's say, for example, OGN Winter was the one famously 2012 where they lost to Najin Sword. Let's say they just wait in the final. Najin Sword beats them. You missed all those classic matchups. You missed that amazing semi-final against the Zubu Blaze. You missed the matchup before that. You wouldn't get these particular games. Think about when CJ Blaze, my favorite team of all time in terms of player, obviously Flame at his peak, right? They were dominant. They were on a winning streak to end it wasn't a split back then, but the first portion of OGN Champions. Now, they, remember, continued the winning streak and went 13-0 before the final where they were upset. Now, in this sort of a world, you wouldn't get to see them beat out. Who did they play first? I think they actually played Frost at some point. And who else did they play in that matchup? I think SK Telecom, right? Reaper's SK Telecom. You wouldn't see these matchups. They'd just script straight to the final and they'd lose there. Much as, by the way, you remember famously the GE Tigers did, where they were dominant in the regular season. Very, very good team. They played one final, which was the only match they played in the playoffs. They just got beat 3-0. And you think, that's fucking underwhelming, isn't it? You never got to see what they were really made of in that particular setting. So you think of all the great teams, Zubu Frost, you think of Zubu Blaze, you think of SK Telecom with Faker, Samsung Blue, those 2 finals runs, Samsung White, obviously, all the times they made it to the semis, and then they lost to Blue that year. well, you'd have never seen that. They'd have just been seeded into the semis. They'd have lost to Blue, and that would have been the end of their tournament run. So if there's the best teams in the world, they're the main teams I want to play. And when do I want to see the best teams in the world play? In the playoffs. I mean, okay, sure, in this format, because it's double round-robin best-of-3, you do get to see all these teams play each other a number of times in the regular split, which you didn't used to see in OGN Champions. I will acknowledge that entirely. But it's not the same, is it? Because the matches that they play in that regular split don't matter as much, quite frankly. And you might never play that specific team in the playoff gauntlet because of where you end up being seeded. So it's not really, doesn't really make up for missing the amazing playoff series that they would have played. I mean, you think of traditional sports, the NHL, the NBA, the NFL even. I mean, the NFL obviously does have a serious aspect where you can skip forwards like NALCS does. But even so, it would be outrageous if the 2007 Patriots had just sat in the Super Bowl final waiting for someone to play them and then obviously wouldn't have all those wins and then they just lost to the Giants anyway. Like, oh, that's a bit underwhelming. Were they the best team ever? Guess we can never even speculate now. Part of the problem here as well is when I think of those all-time great teams of the past I mentioned, Samsung Blue, SK Telecom, Azubu Blaze, Azubu Frost, I remember all the playoff series they played. In fact, when I started following a lot of these traditional sports that I got into, the NHL, the NBA, the NFL, one of the things I love to do is go back, look at the best teams of all time and go watch their playoff runs. See what the Michael Jordan Bulls did when they had to play against the Miami Heat in 1993, or they had to play against the Sixers early on in his career, or later on when they had that epic conference final against the Pacers. He didn't just get to skip to the final or skip into the semi-finals. They had to play all these matchups, and so every time they win the championship, you know they have played. I think in the NBA you play 4 series. Back in Champions, I think you used to play 3 series because you start with the quarterfinals. You have these matches and put a documentation of the epic campaign to win the championship. You don't just skip forwards and basically have the best teams play the fewest matches. Then you also forget the winner and the dominant team. You also miss out on some really great series between teams that weren't going to win the championship. You don't get that amazing matchup where, as I said, 4th place team plays the 1st place team, matches up great with them, maybe doesn't win, but has a crazy series. But you don't get that because actually in this gauntlet, maybe they're not capable of beating number 3 and number 2. You don't end up with those awesome matches where, like, as I said, 3rd seed plays 6th seed, like we had. Remember that year Cloud9 lost to... Well, they lost to Dignitas last season, I think, as the 3rd and 6th seed. We had, obviously, Immortals lose one time in that kind of a scenario. They actually maybe only lost in the finals. Who did Cloud9 lose to that one year? Was it Team Liquid? I'm trying to think who it is. No, it couldn't have been. If it wasn't Team Liquid, who could it have been? CLG, I think. I think it was CLG that beat them, actually. So you don't get to get these great matchups and these ones where, again, actual matchup, how your stylistic components match up or what star players you have elsewhere can't now help you win an amazing series because your seeding's so off that we're distributed away from each other and we don't get any kind of cross-pollination. We just get this linear progression of the bottom teams up the rankings, and either they have to beat everyone and win, so they have to be basically truly all-time great and we didn't know it from the regular season, or we just don't get those matchups and the teams that should win because they're seeded into those rounds win those matches and just go on as expected, and we get less games of the best teams. There's also the factor that playoffs aren't just different in terms of everything matters more, etc. They're different in League of Legends especially, in a way that they actually aren't in other games, because everything about the game changes in a playoff series compared to a regular split best of 3, where sometimes it isn't as important. Not least because you've got so many games to play. There's not only another level of pressure. Yes, that comes in every esport, in every sport. Once you get to the playoffs, this is where your career's made. But think about it. When you're actually in League of Legends, there's a different kind of play involved in the game. I mean, first of all, in a best of 5, adaptation becomes very different to a best of 3 because the way you do your picks is going to be totally different because you might have played 3 games against the guy and the series might not be over yet. And now you can change up, right? Well, I tried letting that through twice. It hasn't worked that well for me. I'm going to ban that now. That doesn't happen in the best of 3. The game's already over. The strategy that you might employ, which players you run through, the type of comp, it might actually work at the beginning of the series. You might get the series wins. Then the other team adapts to you and now you have to counter-adapt to what they're doing. This is a totally different level of play that you won't have in the regular split by virtue of the format and by virtue of the fact it's not the playoffs and people haven't had specific prep time for you in the same way. They're not going to play potentially 5 games against you and all the pressure and all the eyes are not upon you in that scenario. I mean, one of the downsides of this Gauntlet format, and this is one of the first things I noticed, was that first ever split that we used it, the one where GE Tigers made the final. Because that was the one where they were a really good team And then they were in the final and they just got 3-0, and that was it. We never got to see what would have happened if they'd have played CJ, if they'd have played against Jinair in some sort of a playoff series. Maybe they actually were chokers beyond that, and maybe someone like Jinair would have given them a real challenge, or CJ actually, who had that inspired run and almost made that final, maybe they would have just knocked them out in the semi-finals. Who knows, right? We'll never get to see that matchup. Then you think of some of the players who currently are in a position which should make them already potential Hall of Famers, potential best players in the world. And some of them have so little playoff experience because of this format that essentially their success in the regular split has not only punished them by not giving them a chance to get much experience, but it's punished us because we don't get to actually see them play the playoff series. So the most obvious examples to me would be Peanut, the jungler, right? Because Peanut has now been in, let me think, what is it now? I think he's been in something like, was it like 5 finals or 6 finals? Let me think. We've got season 6, those 2, season 7, seasons, 4. He's been in 5 now because it's spring, obviously. So he's been in 5 finals. He hasn't played that many series though, because obviously a bunch of them when he was with Rox, he was just skipping straight to the final. Then he was with SK Telecom. He was also going straight to the final. The guy actually hasn't played that many playoff series. Meanwhile, someone who was like making finals or semis in OGN Champions a few years back has already played more best of 5 series than Peanut has in his career, and he's been in the finals all these times. Then you think of the Longdew team, which actually, funnily enough, he's now joined. They were so dominant in the regular split last year that they just skipped straight to the final, won 1 series and won the title. Then they went to Worlds, lost the next best of 5 they played, which was against Samsung, because they'd had fuck all experience playing best of 5s. What's ridiculous is Samsung themselves came in way more prepped because of the playoffs and the Gauntlet, and then obviously they go into that matchup. So you're in a scenario where you can be the champion, you can be someone who, in theory, is one of the best teams in the world, and you are totally untested. You aren't even experienced, and yet you're in the final. I actually think that that did hold back the development of teams like the Rox Tigers, like Longdew now, and it took these teams years longer than it would have, splits longer, than if they'd have been in a normal format. Because I think think of the Immortals teams from Season 6, who were obviously number 1 and number 2 in terms of ranking, very dominant in the regular split, but they kept getting banged out in the semis. That would have actually shown us something about these squads and either forced them to evolve or put them in their actual proper place, which is if you add in the choking and the pressure of the final, the playoffs and not being experienced, and then other teams being very good in best of X series, then they wouldn't be making finals and they wouldn't be getting embarrassed in finals or winning finals and then not really having shown the pedigree and the mettle of a champion. Because to me, the Longdew one was the most egregious because you had a team that obviously was fresh. A bunch of them hadn't played at the top level before. Obviously, Praying Gorilla had, but the rest of them pretty much not. And they got into they had an amazing first split. Then they got into the final. They won the final. Great. The number 1 seed from Korea should nearly always be considered a team that you expect to win Worlds, right? And they didn't even make top 4 Worlds. And when you saw them lose, it was understandable, right? I mean, they weren't as battle-tested, as decorated and dominant as some of the past teams that you think of with Korean teams in history. And unfortunately, that's an extreme example. That's not going to happen very often, but that did really highlight some of the flaws of the Gauntlet system to me. This video was supported by Dean Tanglis, Michael Allaire, Andreas Westerlund, Alex Adams, Gman, Twch, Jerky's Minion, Gianfranco Ingrata, Anthony, Bash, TGreb, Yordan, Tsenkov, Daniel Yordanov. Want to suggest guests or topics for my content? Well, keep it G-rated and unlock the code to the streets, gaining exclusive access via the Patreon link below. The Scrilluminati grows daily.